Okay, we pick up with chapter 17, verse 8. Um, we've been looking at various institutions. We talked about the courts, the magistrates, what the qualifications for judges are, particular warnings about not taking bribes, and then that very famous passage, Tzedek tzedek tirdof, you should pursue justice, emphatically pursue justice. And what I want to pick up now is a little bit about the justice system, and then we're going to look at the role of the king, this institution, which in some ways is alien to the spirit of Judaism, but is a concession, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, actually, you know what? Before we even do this, I feel like it would be worth spending 5 minutes or so just talking about the holiday of Shavuot, because we are literally 2 days away from Shavuot. It starts on Thursday night, and though it is a major festival, it is absolutely on par with Pesach and Sukkot. It tends to be the most neglected of the big festivals. I think one reason is that there's nothing in particular to do. You have a Seder, you build a sukkah, and it comes to Shavuot, and you go to synagogue and eat dairy. So I just a couple of things about it. As you know, because we looked at it not long ago, Shavuot is an agricultural festival. It really is the culmination of the period which begins in Passover. It's known as Atzeret, which is the ending or closing of this holiday season, just as we have Shmini Atzeret, the end of the holiday season in the fall. And interestingly enough, both of them, the very end of the fall holidays and the end now of the spring holiday period, culminates in something having to do with the Torah, because the rabbis, doing a very careful calculation, come to the conclusion that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai on Shavuot. So what are the implications of that? There are a variety of traditions. In the synagogue itself, the night before Shavuot, it's customary to have what's called a tikkun leil Shavuot, which is a night of study, and many congregations do that. And now it's being done nationally. Also, the Rabbinical Assembly has tikkun leil Shavuot. This is based around a passage in Jewish mysticism in the primary text, which is the Zohar. And this is about adorning the bride for her wedding. In mystical terms, the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai is considered the marriage between God and the people of Israel, and we receive the Torah as our ketubah, as our wedding contract. God has now made this, and like most marriages, there are obligations. And so we become bound by the Torah at Mount Sinai when we receive it. And so the idea is that the night before the wedding, you adorn the bride. And, how does one adorn a bride? Well, you adorn the bride with Torah. Right? And so the idea is to study, and there's, according to some traditions, you study from the Torah, you study from prophets, you study from Talmudic material, and ultimately from mystical material as well. So that's the night before. And then in the morning, the tradition is to read about the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, including the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 words or the 10 commandments. And that's the version that we find in Exodus, not the version that we recently studied in Deuteronomy. The Haftarah, which corresponds in theme to the day, is one of the most remarkable of the year. It's the opening chapter of Ezekiel, where the prophet has this sense of God enthroned and visibly see it in this psychedelic kind of picture, sees God's chariot and a figure that is seated upon that chariot. It's a bizarre and wild passage and worth looking at it. It gives rise to a whole literature, a mystical literature in Judaism, which is Maaseh HaMerkavah, the doings of the chariot, because God is seen on this chariot surrounded by these angels and wheels, and it'll blow your mind if you take a look at it. And that is the Haftorah for the first day. There's a tradition of adorning the synagogue with branches and flowers. According to the Midrash, it's not in the Torah at all, Mount Sinai was covered with flowers at the time of the revelation. And so this tradition builds from there. And the tradition of eating dairy on Shavuot, at least the evening meal is milchiks, and various, cheesecake becomes common, blintzes, things like that. It's really not clear exactly what the connection is. The Torah compared to milk, or the land is milk and honey. There's some reflection of the Torah there also. There's one of my favorite explanations, which I think is just fanciful, is that people receive the Torah on Shavuot, including the rules of kashrut, and they say, oh, this kosher business is very complicated. We'll eat dairy for now, and then we'll learn what it is that we're supposed to do. There are those who, however, insist that they also eat meat on Shavuot, generally at lunch, because there's a passage in the Talmud, Ein simcha ela b'basar v'yayin. There's no joy without meat and wine, two things that were offered in the temple on the holidays. Nonetheless, it's perfectly legitimate to be a vegetarian. I want to emphasize that. Okay, so a little bit about Shavuot. I'll open it up briefly if anyone has any questions or comments about Shavuot this week or the celebration of it. And seeing none,
just suppose.
Okay, so Hannah
Well,
and Barry, go ahead.
I suppose as long as the vegetarian is joyful.
Yes, and some of us certainly find joy in eating dairy. So yes, it's about simcha, it's about joy. That's the primary reason for doing it. Hannah, did you want to say something? You're muted. Hannah, you're muted.
Yeah, just a little memory. When I taught art in Israel, the students taught me. They did pictures of Har Sinai with flowers, and I kind of asked, "What is this?" And then I saw they all did that. That's how I learned about that.
Yeah, that is the Midrash. Okay, we're going to go back now, and I'm going to pick up pretty much where we left off. Again, we're at Deuteronomy chapter 17, and we are beginning with verse 8. And what we get here is the establishment of a kind of high court. We have judges and officials. We saw that at the beginning of the Parsha, and we have rules about the judges and warnings that they shouldn't take bribes and so on, and you need 2 witnesses. But here we get a high court. So if a case is too baffling for you to decide, meaning the judges, be there a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you will promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God has chosen. So there is this high court, and you go to the high court, but it's clear that this is not a reference to this is a court that is able to it's not an appeals court in the way that we think of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does have the role in America also of trying to harmonize or rule on various local courts that have rulings that seem to be at odds with each other. But here we're not really talking about that. We're talking about this sense of we don't know what to do. The law isn't clear, or perhaps the evidence isn't exactly what we can figure out. And so we refer to this court. And it's striking that the court exists. The picture that we've had in the past, and we saw it in Numbers, is they'd come to Moses, and if he was the ultimate decider, and if he is unable to see what the law should be, then he consults his higher court, which is God, right? And he'll go in and he'll ask God, well, these guys were not able to celebrate Passover at the appropriate time. What should be done? And God says, okay, we'll have a make-up Passover for them. And similarly, here we see something which is which takes the place of Moses. And I would just, if I'll jump ahead for a minute. So if there's a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, you'll go to the place and appear before the Levitic priests or the magistrate in charge at that time. So Deuteronomy is now looking forward to a time after the people have entered the land, a time when Moses is no longer around, and we're going to have a very different kind of system of justice. So I also want to just point out that when it says homicide, civil law, or assault, it's worth looking at the Hebrew. Yifalei mimcha davar lishpat. And then here are the various cases where we said homicide, civil law, and assault. Bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, uvein nega lenega, right? Dam ledam, udin ledin. You notice the alliterative quality. This isn't poetry here, but the Torah does do this. The ordering here is really based, I think, when we list what the kinds of matters are that could come before this referral court, it's listed in a very alliterative way, even though this looks quite dry. Okay, so they go to the place that God has chosen, and they appear before, and now we get who makes up this court of referral, of the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at that time. I want to point out that there's an ambiguity here, because if you look at the Hebrew, El HaKohanim HaLeviim, the Levitical priest, Ve El HaShofet. So the Hebrew it's Vav, right? Ve'el, which can mean or it could mean and, right? So it's not clear if this court is either Levitical priests or the magistrate, or it's Levitical priest and a magistrate. That is to say, people who are not priests. More than that, there's something remarkable in Deuteronomy's phrasing here, in that HaKohanim HaLeviim, Levitical priests. So these are B'nai Levi, what we would call Levites, right, and Kohanim, and there doesn't seem to be a distinction. In other words, when we think about Kohanim and when we saw them in the other books of the Bible, they're all descendants of Aaron. That seems to be the rule. You want to serve as a priest, you have to be a descendant of Aaron. It seems like in the book of Deuteronomy, all you have to be is a member of the tribe of Levi. That is, every Levite is eligible to be a priest, not just the descendants of Aaron. Now, of course, Jewish tradition winds up reading this as only the descendants of Aaron, though there are some exceptions where people who do not seem to be get appointed to be the priests, often by political authorities, and that becomes very controversial among the people who, they may be Levites, but they're not descendants of Aaron. In general, the Jewish tradition reads this question as it's read in most of the Bible, which is to say you have to be a descendant of Aaron. So we have this court. It's where you referred hard cases, and it's made up of priests and lay people. How many? According to rabbinic tradition, there are 71. The very big court, and it becomes the basis for a later institution, which is known as the Sanhedrin, which becomes the ultimate judicial body for the Jewish people. This is not the Sanhedrin, and it doesn't tell us how many, but the rabbis want to ground the Sanhedrin in this passage, and so they figure out that it's going to have 71 people. And you go to this court, present the problem. When they have announced to you the verdict, you carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord will observe, right? So the people who come bring the case, and then they are the ones who, having now gotten the law clarified, they are the ones who are going to go out and implement the case. It's interesting. It goes on to say, scrupulously observing their instructions, you should act in accordance with the instructions. And the Hebrew word for instructions is Torah, right? So in this case, Torah is something very specific, right? Torah is a law or an instruction in a given case. And this really comes back to a theme that we've seen time and again, that though we use the word Torah to refer to the 5 books, actually it can mean, and often within them does mean, any single law. In this case, it's the law that, this court has given. We get elsewhere something that says, Zet Torah HaMitzora. This is the Torah of the person who is stricken with a skin disease. And we see it in many, many places under different circumstances. We think of it as the first 5 books, and then more generally, it refers to all Jewish learning today. So if you ask someone, what do you do? And they say, I study Torah, it doesn't mean that they necessarily are studying the Chumash, right? It could mean they study Talmud. It could mean that they even study law codes, but it's all Torah. Okay, that being an aside, you should do it. You don't deviate from the verdict that they announce, either to the right or to the left, right? So you absolutely have to carry it out as it is specified, and you have to do it scrupulously and, as it were, to the letter of the law. And now it goes on to say, should a man act presumptuously and disregard the priest charged with serving the Lord your God, or the magistrate, that person will die, right? So there's an extraordinary penalty here if you neglect to follow this, because it's going to lead to just chaos, right? This has to be the ultimate court. The word has to be binding. And it seems to be that this is not the litigant, right? Two people have a dispute. They go to the judge now brings the dispute to this court of referral. The court of referral makes a decision. The judge's job is to implement that decision. If the judge fails to do that, then we're talking about the punishment for the judge. It's not if the litigants fail to obey. It is the implementation by the lower court of this upper court ruling. And now we're going to go on to something that's really quite interesting, I think. And that is the king, right? We've looked at courts, we're looking at the role of, of the role of the Levites, right? These are the major institutions of biblical Israel. And now the king. If after you enter the land that the Lord your God has assigned you and take possession of it and settle it, you decide, I will set a king over me as the other nations do, you will be free to do it. So this becomes extremely controversial because God is meant to be the king of Israel. And we say that all the time. He is king. He was king. He will be king. Right? Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai yimloch, forever, le'olam va'ed. So how is it that we can assign an earthly king? This comes about for the first time in the book of Samuel, where we see, and just a word about this, who is the king? The king is the ruler over the entire Jewish people. If you look at the history of the Jewish people after they enter the land, there are skirmishes between the Israelites and other peoples around them, the Philistines, for example, and there are leaders who will come unite the tribes to fight those battles. And the people will have chosen those leaders and unite behind them. Those are the shoftim, the judges. They're not kings. Once the battle is over, they just go back to being everyday people. All right. Here we're talking about someone who is the ruler of the entire people of Israel. If you want that, you can have it. So they go to Samuel and they say, we want a king. Everybody else has a king. We want a king. And Samuel does, who's the prophet, he does not like it. And he fights against it, but ultimately he appoints, through a process where God clearly elects him, he appoints King Saul, who becomes the first king of Israel. So there is a kind of ambivalence about the institution of the king. And we see that here to a degree in the sense that you decide. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm allowing you to do that. And what's the reason that you want to do that? Well, according to the passage here, everybody else has a king. Why can't we be a normal people, right? And after all, God is the king, will continue in some sense to be the king, but God's not there. Everybody else has a king who's there, right? So if you want to do it, you can do it. The other thing, though, is that the king that you decide you want one, God gets to pick the king. And how would God do that? Through a prophet. That's exactly what happens with the first king of Israel, with Saul, as Samuel is the one who anoints him as the king. And there's a little ritual, there's a kind of test to see if he's really the one that God has chosen. He passes the test, and then because it's clear that God has picked him, even though God in some sense is unhappy that the people really, don't just, it's not enough for them that God is their king. At any rate, you can do it. God chooses this person. Be sure the king is one of your own people, not a foreigner, one who is not your kinsman. Okay. And now we get some concerns, very odd and specific concerns. Moreover, he should not keep many horses, can't have too many horses, send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. He shall not have many wives, or lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. So it's striking, by the way, that the third king of Israel, who was known as the wisest of all men, King Solomon, did all these things. He had lots and lots of wives. He taxed the people tremendously and collected a great deal of wealth. And his stables were fabled. The number of horses that he had. In fact, there's a place in the south of Israel you can go that's been excavated, which is known as Solomon's Stables. Now, whether it really is the place where Solomon had his stables, I have no idea. But you have this sense that Solomon, and so the rabbis immediately ask, how could Solomon, the wisest of all people, do such a thing? And the problem is, it was his wisdom, because Solomon said, yes, I know the Torah says this, but I won't fall into the trap that these things will bring. I understand. The horses won't be a problem for me. The women won't be a problem for me. The money won't be a problem for me, because I understand the pitfalls and I will avoid them. But needless to say, the rabbis do not take a positive view of this. Anyway, let's look at the specifics. So horses really have to do, right, and horses, chariots, so on, have to do with a kind of private army. This will be the king's elite guard. And that idea of the king, but it's about power, it's about prestige, right? It's about, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Saddam Hussein had this group of troops of sort of that were considered his personal army, right? Who were feared and fierce and so on. Don't do that. And in particular, don't go to Egypt and get horses, even a reasonable notion of horses, because God says you can't go back to Egypt. It doesn't actually say that anywhere in the Torah. There's nowhere that it says it's forbidden to go to Egypt. The Torah does take a dim view of Egypt. Says that you have to forgive the Egyptians for what they did to you. But here we have this sense that it would not be good for Solomon to go back to Egypt or send any Jews back. It's going to be kind of alluring. Not to have too many wives. By the way, how many is too many? According to the rabbis, you can't have more than 18.
Oh my God.
I don't know why the number 18. Maybe it's because it's high. I have no idea. It's interesting that one of the Dead Sea Scrolls interprets this to mean one, that the king can only have one life, even in a culture which permitted bigamy. So presumably he'll get too involved with them and he won't be He won't be concerned with affairs of state. That's one possibility. And then the other possibility, which I think is more reasonable in some ways, it says, Lo yasor livavo, his heart should not go astray. There is this sense that they could lure him to be astray. And we know in the time of King Solomon that he had all these wives, and he built palaces for them, and he allowed them to build temples to their gods, which becomes a tremendous temptation, right? So better not to have too many wives. Solomon, of course, did that all for alliances. He was trying to build his kingdom and enlarge it. And so, he married into the families of the nations that were around him, very much the way the British royalty did at one time. Silver and gold, right, is probably about taxation, right? Because how does a king enrich himself? He has to take it from somewhere, and the idea that he takes it from the people around him. Okay, so we can't have a king who does all those things. He's not able to act in this way. And now we get this. When he is seated on his royal throne, that is, as soon as he is seated, once he's appointed, when he takes the throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll. If you look at note 18, it says in the Eitz Chaim, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by Levitical priests. Comment. Better, that is a better, more accurate reading of translation of the Hebrew. He shall write a copy of this teaching for himself on a scroll from the one which is in charge of the Levitical priests. So what this seems to be saying, what's the king's job as soon as he gets on the throne? He has to make a copy of the Torah. Now, what the Torah is that he's copying, likely the book of Deuteronomy, probably more than that. In the most limited, if you wanted to take this in its context, it may be that the Torah that is written here is simply this passage which says the king is not allowed to have many horses, many wives, right? He has to write that out. Certainly rabbinic tradition sees him as writing a Torah, right? And the idea here is, it's really got to be imprinted on his mind. It can't just be a book that he consults, and it remains with him, and let him read it in all his life, right? So he can't go anywhere without his copy of the Torah. And he should be studying it constantly, right? So, kol yemei chayav, right? All the days of his life, right? Rather than in all his life, taking the language here literally, all the days of his life, meaning what? Meaning each and every day. So, who is the king accountable to? He's accountable to God, and he's accountable to implement and to live out the Torah which God has given him. He needs to be the exemplar par excellence of living a Torah life. Right? That's the king's role. So, compare this to ancient Egypt, the place that the people have come from. What is the king? The king is a god, period. And the king gives laws, and those laws have to be followed. Not the king is consulting God's laws and conveying God's laws. And God is different. It's not the king in ancient Egypt, as it was in many of the surrounding cultures around the land of Israel. They don't necessarily see the kings as gods, but that sense of the king as absolute, unquestioned, not subservient to anything, you see here. And in ways I think that are still relevant to when, I mean, the people who established the Constitution did know their Bible, right? And they also had a terrible experience with the King of England. And I wonder whether they read, "He shall not amass silver and gold to excess," and wondered about taxation without representation, right? This whole idea that the king is the servant of the people and not the people as the king's servants is something that we really see here in Deuteronomy. It's, I think, enormously important. He shall not act haughtily towards his fellows. Notice, Levilti rum levavo me'echav, lift up his heart over his brothers. Reminder here that they are his brothers. In other words, the king is equal to everybody else. There's no inherent difference between the king and every other human being, except that God has chosen this particular man to lead the people. I say man. It is true, however, that when we get into the rabbinic period, we do have queens in Israel. Queen Helene, for example, after whom a street is named in Jerusalem. And then the last piece of this is Leman ya'arich yamim, that he shall live a long life, and on his throne, he'll be there a long time, he and his descendants. So here we do have a sense of the monarchy as being hereditary. God is going to choose the king, and then the next king, all things being equal, is going to be a child of that king. That doesn't happen with Saul. Saul is such a bad king that the monarchy, he doesn't live out his life as the king. It gets taken from him. It gets given to David, who then becomes a king from whom the kings of Israel now will descend. And that hereditary monarchy does become a fact, so much so that the claim to be a son of David is necessary in order to be a monarch. And that's one of the reasons why the tradition is that the Messiah who comes eventually, the King Messiah, Melech HaMashiach, that person will be a descendant of David. Melech HaMashiach ben David. Because of this passage, which suggests, and of course there's nothing unique in this, because actually the most of the other nations also have hereditary monarchs, as do monarchies to this day. Okay, so we're going to move on. You know what? Let me do this. Let me stop here, at least for a moment. And we are going to stop early. I know Sandy had wanted to do that, and there's going to be some presentation. So,
excuse me, Rabbi, I have a question. Why did Saul hate David so much?
Okay, so I'm gonna pull up the view, and I will take that question. Okay, so why does Saul hate David so much? Because Saul tries to kill David. Right. Why does he hate him so much? He is deeply jealous of him. He feels insecure. David is this enormously powerful military leader who wins all of these battles. People are talking about David and not Saul. And it also seems that Saul's paranoia really, goes to the extent of madness. And it's so extreme that Saul's own son, Jonathan, allies himself with David over his father. So Saul is, by most standards, he's just a terrible king. He was also, though, enormously good looking. He was tall and handsome, in some ways an ideal politician. When he's chosen, everybody's, yeah, Saul, great, Saul. But it does not play out that way. And David, at least initially, seems quite loyal to Saul. And when the king is overcome by madness, it is David who, playing his harp and singing his songs, is able to soothe Saul. But ultimately, his paranoia becomes too much. Okay.
Happen too often with leaders in the world.
Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you.
Talking about Jonathan and David, we just read that Haftorah on Shabbat.
Right.
That's the, we read
Right.
for Erev Rosh Chodesh.
Yes,
Also,
right.
when
Machar HaChodesh.
you used to teach about the kings, there were also some children. Remember, some very young ones. Did they what about them? Did they also have to write a Torah and all that?
Well, so this is an idealized version of kingship.
Mm-hmm.
It is not at all clear that kings follow this.
Oh, I see.
But this is what they are meant to do.
Oh, okay. But it doesn't mean that it actually happened. Okay.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
Like many things in the
Right.
Bible,
True. Thank you.
it's not at all clear that they happen. Yes. Go ahead, Barry.
There is a form of government in which there's no separation or little separation between church and state.
Yes, absolutely.
An example of, is where the country is ruled by Sharia law. Is there any sense in this passage that the kingship has very little separation between the church and state?
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. There is no sense. The idea here is that the law of the land is meant to be Torah law. That it does mean that people are free to establish laws that would be in accordance with the Torah. So they're allowed to establish boundaries and to enforce laws against people overstepping boundaries. And the Torah says you shouldn't cheat people. Well, how does that actually play out? What constitutes cheating and all that kind of thing that the people are able to establish. And a lot of that comes through the Talmud, where they essentially are trying to do that. But this is a theocracy without question. And it is understood that way. And by the way, right now, there's this battle in Israel over judicial reform. And one of the, parties involved is insisting that Israel has to be governed by Torah. Right? You have parties that are saying exactly that. They reject the idea of Israel as being essentially a secular democratic state, which is sensitive to and defers to religious law, but only to a limited extent. And in fact, if you look at law in Israel, it's often a compilation of law that goes back even to the Ottoman Empire, right? It's not, and British common law and other things. That is not intended here to be the legal system of Israel, of the people, the Israelites. It's intended as a theocracy. Other questions or comments before? Go ahead, Saul.
Yeah, going back to the selection of the judges, the Supreme Court. In this sentence 12, Ha'ish asher ya'aseh bizadon,
Right.
This seems to apply both to the litigant as well as to the judge.
That's
And,
not how the tradition interprets it. I can see the argument, but this is generally understood as applying to the judge. It is the judge. In fact, it is the judge who, if he doesn't obey the court, and then the Talmud then gets into this question of, can the judge teach something which seems to contradict the court? And the answer is yes. They're allowed to have another opinion. They're allowed to share that opinion. What's different is that they can have it, they can share it, but they can't implement it. So there is a kind of freedom of conscience and freedom of thought, but the law is the law. I'll mention one other thing which I failed to mention before we stop, and that is the phrase they should go to the judge who is there at that time. Right? So this is also, I talked before about how Moses will be gone and you'll need, a judge, courts. But the idea here is they can decide things based on the world that they experience, right? In other words, the idea is the situation may be different at that time. And therefore they can make decisions which seem to be different, even from the precedents that they have experienced. And you could imagine, a court in a situation where times have changed very much, and they're not clear, given the new circumstances, how the law should be applied. Right? And we've seen this in medical ethics all the time now. Right? What do we do? What do we do with a situation where you can have transplant a heart? What's the definition of death? All of that. Well, we have traditional sources on that, but they didn't anticipate the situations that we would find today. And so how do you do it? Even though you know what the law is, right? For what's the difference between someone being alive and someone being dead? Well, the classic definition is their heart doesn't beat and they're not breathing. Right? Should that still be the standard today when we can do all those things artificially? And so we've moved to a kind of brain death standard, not universally accepted. But how do we just throw off what the Talmud says? Well, you look at the judges who were there in that time. And I think the emphasis here is there for a reason. And it's certainly been understood that way in subsequent generations. That it all gets judged circumstantially. And one of the interesting differences between Ashkenazic and Sephardic decisors, right, judges, has been because Ashkenazic authorities tend to be much stricter. Sephardic authorities tend to be, I would say, more lenient. It's hard to put it into words. And someone once pointed out to me, well, there's a big difference. Ashkenazic authorities are often yeshivas surrounded by yeshiva students. Sephardic authorities traditionally did not do that. They lived in towns. They're dealing with townspeople. They're dealing with a world in which they have to worry about whether their decisions will be accepted or not accepted. Their circumstances are different, and therefore their legal decisions are also different. The spirit of them, very different. Okay, I am going to stop at this point so that we could have this presentation, and I appreciate it. I think it's completely unnecessary, nonetheless. And I think, and Sandy, you wanted to share your screen or whatever you want to do.
Okay. So we were going to do this at the very last class. I understand there will be 2 more classes, Rabbi, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, but because of Shavuot, we decided to do it now. So on behalf of our class, I thank you so much for teaching your thoughtful and thought-provoking Bible classes in which you share your wisdom and insights. We look forward to your classes and enjoy so much learning from you. We're giving you a few gifts as tokens of our appreciation. So there'll be Hannah is going to go first, and then Barry will present the other gifts. And thank you, Beth, for helping out.
No problem.
We start with Hannah. Hannah is a wonderful artist, and she created something beautiful for you. And Hannah, did you want to say a few words?
I hope we have time, Rabbi, for you to open it, if it's still.
Beth is giving me a box, so I will open it.
Okay.
And see here. Oh my goodness. Look at this. Well, let me show it to everybody. Dear Rabbi, we thank you for leading us through the desert, through our wonderful Torah, and helping to make our beautiful heritage come alive. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with great patience and goodwill. Yeah, it's lovely. It really is. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can you hold it up again, Rabbi?
Yes.
I'm going to share the screen so you can see it.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Put it back up. Oh, there it is.
There it
Okay.
Oh,
Isn't that fabulous? Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
That's really beautiful.
Glad it arrived in one piece.
That's
Good.
great.
Yes.
Yes. It came in one piece. It was wrapped carefully.
That's
Good.
beautiful, really beautiful.
Good. Enjoy.
Thank you.
And then Barry's going to say a few words.
yes, some of what I prepared has already been said, but I'll repeat it. Because I want to thank you on behalf of our small but dedicated Bible class for teaching us Torah. As a token of its appreciation, you've received a package of nut and dried fruit, along with a babka. Is that what you received? Or is that did you receive that gift yet?
Coming today.
If you didn't, I'm not sure whether you received just the card or also the package.
Well, I want to thank you all for the tribute and the gifts, and which are, I would say, totally unnecessary. I also thank those who, many of you who sponsored the class this year, making the gifts even more unnecessary, but very welcome. The last thing I'll say is that one of the reasons it's unnecessary is because this is such a joy for me. This is, the ultimate gift that you give me is being here on Tuesday mornings, and giving me the opportunity to teach Torah. I don't have a lot of those opportunities anymore now that I'm retired. It's really just such a joy that, the opportunity in itself is the greatest gift. I do mean that. If anyone else has anything they want to say, I want to give you a minute.
Hi, Mom.
Just want to say thank you.
Yes, so grateful for this time, because you're still preparing.
Yeah. No,
And we appreciate not just the time with us, but the time to prepare.
Well, thanks. I do enjoy the preparation is also tremendously enjoyable. And as much as I've studied Torah and have done so, most of my life, I'm always learning new stuff. I think one of the proofs of the divinity of the Torah is that it's inexhaustible. That the more you look, the more you find, the more you see, And you know, I think it's also interesting that as you grow older, different things speak to you in different ways. You have a relationship essentially with Torah. It's not a book that you study. In some ways, you know, you impose yourself on it, but it imposes itself on you, and that's one of the things that's most extraordinary. So we will have 2 more sessions, then we'll take a break for the summer. We'll be coming back in September, and I'll be in touch before then. I expect to continue on Tuesday mornings at 11. It seems to work for most people. And I do not expect to finish Deuteronomy this year. I mean, we're on chapter 17, and though some of the chapters are quite short, I don't see how we could finish. So we will pick up in the fall. So we finish the book and then go on to study something else. I'm not quite sure what that will be yet, but I will keep you posted. So thanks, everybody, and see you next week.
Hag Sameach.
Hag
Hag
Sameach.
Thank you very
Hag
much.
Hag Sameach.